What does the Bible say about feminism? This is part two of our series looking at the issue of feminism and more broadly then the issue of men's and women's roles. Last time in part one, we gave an overview of feminism and I tried to show that it is contrary to the scriptures. It is not a valid way of looking at the way the Bible describes the differences between men and women and their respective roles. The goal of part two will be to look at the other potential positions or the responses to feminism so that we can have a clear understanding of what the Bible actually does teach with regard to the different roles of men and women. Now, feminism has had a great impact on the church, and so there have been a number of ways in which the church has responded to the challenge of feminism with really varying levels of compromise. And so, what I'm going to argue here is that the historic position of the church, the thing to which feminism was reacting against, which is patriarchy, that is actually the teaching of the scriptures, and it is in fact correct. So that patriarchy is actually the thing that is in fact taught in the Bible. The feminists actually did get that right. They were just wrong to see that it's wrong. It is in fact the right and good position. It is the position that will honor women the most and also preserve order within the home. And it is, in fact, something that has been largely abandoned today. That is to say, that fathers are to rule in the home. So that's what the meaning of patriarchy. Here today, we have a situation where women are constantly trying to assert themselves into roles that men have historically had. And we also have men defecting and being unwilling to lead. And so both of these problems come from an abandoning of the biblical view of patriarchy. So now, what are these different views and responses to feminism? There are several of them. There is egalitarianism, there's complementarianism, there's patriarchy, and then just to round things out, I'm also going to discuss very briefly chauvinism, which I'll use that to distinguish between patriarchy and some of the objections that come from the feminists. Feminists will say that patriarchy is inherently oppressive. I'm going to show that patriarchy is in fact not oppressive. It would actually be a kind of chauvinism or a male chauvinism that is in fact when you get into true oppression and things that are undermining women being made in the image of God. So we'll go through each of these one at a time and I'll give a brief evaluation and explanation of what they are. So the first is egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is basically an extreme compromise with feminism. In egalitarianism, there is basically the idea that feminists, at least in a moderate kind of conclusion sort of way, that they are essentially correct, that there's really no distinction between men and women, and that any kind of hierarchy in terms of authority and submission is inherently oppressive to women and needs to be gotten rid of. That's sort of the baseline fundamental conclusion and thesis of feminism. And egalitarianism wants to say basically that's correct. And so the difference between them and feminists is that they also want to say that the Bible is authoritative, that the Bible is good. And so there is more of an attempt to hold to a higher view of Scripture while still having the conclusions of feminists. Now, this creates a great amount of tension. The feminists themselves, first, second, third wave feminism, feminists today, are very clear about their view of the parts of Scripture that speak to men and particularly husbands in the home having authority over their wives and that women need to submit to their husbands. Feminists believe that the Bible is patriarchal, that it expresses the view of patriarchy. And so it's very difficult then for an egalitarian to say, well, we have this higher view of the scriptures, but we accept the conclusions of the feminists, and somehow we're able to put that together. It creates a large amount of tension. It is, I believe, contradictory. The feminists have gotten it right, that the scriptures do in fact teach that the husband is the head of the household. And as such, he has a kind of authority. There is a real authority that the husband does in fact have. And so egalitarians, again, they are trying to affirm the basic correctness of feminism while trying to hold to the authority of the scriptures. And really, overall, either one or the other has to give. That's really what has to happen. There's really no way to have this middle position consistently, and there's always going to be a tendency to move towards something more conservative with regard to the views of the scripture or more towards feminism and then giving up the authority of the scripture. It's an unstable position. So now that's the first position, the first response to feminism, which is basically just a compromise with it. The second position I want to talk about then is complementarianism. And sometimes this discussion between men's and women's roles gets simplified down to just egalitarianism versus complementarianism. But as you can tell by now, it is actually a bit more complex than that. Complementarianism began as a theological movement in the 1970s as a response to egalitarianism. And what was then called evangelical feminism. That's the term that they use for the egalitarians. And so this was an attempt to show that the Bible does in fact teach that there are distinct roles for men and women. There are two kinds of complementarianism. There's broad complementarianism and narrow complementarianism. So narrow complementarianism would see a more restricted view of the differences between men and women. It would basically restrict it only to the home and the church. And so, narrow complementarians will say, the Bible clearly does teach that the man is the head of the home, and that in this sense, wives need to submit to their husbands in a way that it would be inappropriate for a husband to submit to his wife. And then also we find male leadership in the church. So a pastor must be a man, that sort of thing, or even extending it to elders. So that would be narrow complementarianism. Broad complementarianism would have a fuller view typically, and again, there would be a gradient and a scale within all of these. But in broad complementarianism, there would be a fuller view of the distinction between men and women in the church, perhaps. So it would extend to more things than just simply holding the office, though in some ways not too much more. And then secondly, there would also be a recognition that some of these principles would in fact apply in the public sphere beyond just the home and the church. So that would be broad complementarianism. Now, one of the problems with complementarianism in all forms is that in some ways it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't really restore to the church the historic position that was held. And so whereas egalitarianism is basically wanting to say feminism is essentially correct, complementarianism critiques egalitarianism, but yet makes some compromises with it. And so one of the things that happens is that even though complementarianism will ground the distinction between men and women in the created order, there is a hesitancy to ground this distinction in terms of the created order fully in the way in which men and women have been made. And so the idea is that there will be arguments that the differences between men and women must carry on because it is rooted in creation, and yet the differences between men and women are not actually rooted in the way in which they have been made. So what I mean by that is that there is a tendency not to see, for instance, the idea of men leading. There's a tendency not to see that as being correlated to the fact that men have been made stronger than women, or that women should be in the home raising children. There's a tendency not to want to correlate that with the fact that women have been made with bodies that clearly are related to raising children. They carry children, their bodies nourish children, that sort of thing. So there's this idea of being that is in some ways separated from the roles that men and women have. So one of the things then that happens traditionally and historically in patriarchy is there is this assertion that man has the role that he has and woman has the role that she has because of the way that men and women have been made. And if this is the case, then these distinctions would apply to every area of life in ways that are appropriate. So, for instance, it is then wrong for women to fight in combat, to defend men, because they've clearly not been made to do that. It is shameful for a man to have to rely on a woman to protect him, rather than for the man to step up and to protect the woman. It is man's duty to protect women. And so this would be an example of ways in which men and women have been made determine the roles in society, even beyond just the home and the family. And so that's the main difference between complementarianism then and patriarchy. So in patriarchy, the idea is that there are these differences of roles, and they are grounded in the way in which men and women have been made. That is to say, then, that there is a kind of consistency between the way God has made man and the roles that God has given to man in the Word. And so both of those are found in the Scriptures. God will speak directly to the roles that men and women have in the Scriptures, but also He is in some ways shown what these are to be also in the way in which he has made men and women. And so the wisest thing for men and women to do is to conform to the way in which they have been made, and not to resist the way that they have been made, not to try to act contrary to nature, but to act in accordance with nature and with the scriptures, and fulfill the roles that God has given to men and women in society. This is going to be what makes for the best situation for both men and women. And as I mentioned in part one, this is in fact the thing that is most honoring to women. One of the things that we see in feminism is this idea that a woman basically cannot have a meaningful life or work. She can't fulfill a meaningful purpose or goal in life unless she is acting like a man and fulfilling jobs that men have historically done. But in this age where in feminism there is this accusation against patriarchy that it is oppressive to women, that it is contrary to their interests. One author even says that it's not even an adult-sized participation in society. But insofar as feminism accuses patriarchy of demeaning women in this way, they actually, the feminists actually demean themselves, because they will not recognize the worth, the dignity, and the importance of the role that God has in fact given to women, and which women will always gravitate to. It will always be natural for women to want to be in the home. There will always be a large percentage of women who want to be in the home, who want to raise a family, because God has made women for this particular task and for this particular role. And what we see, if we look back at the history of the church, is that women were honored. They were honored for carrying out this particular role in society. And so we have 19th century authors who are fighting against feminism, who will say things like, the godliness of women is what upholds all of society, because all people must be raised by women. And if women are godly, then the society will in fact be able to continue, and there will be godly leaders in all spheres of life. Now, the last position is chauvinism, a male chauvinism. And this would be truly an oppressing of women, because it would not recognize the equal status of women as being made in the image of God. And so one of the things that patriarchy holds together is the idea that men and women are made equal in the sense that they are both made in the image of God, and therefore both are heirs of the grace of life. So there is an equality with regard to dignity and worth, and yet there is a distinction, a even hierarchy in terms of authority. And then so that this would play out in different roles and structures, that sort of thing. So man is the head of woman, and yet also both are equally, with no distinction in this regard, made in the image of God. Now, if you have the authority structure, so to speak, without also maintaining the equality with regard to being made in the image of God, then you get something like a male chauvinism, a kind of oppression of women. And I would say this is what distinguishes the historic Christian position from something like Islam, where women really are not treated well at all, where men have all of the authority, not just in terms of structures, but there is even a kind of degrading of women. So what the Bible does is it shows forth an equality in terms of dignity, and yet shows a distinction in terms of role. And it is really when men and women are fulfilling the role that God has given to them, that he's even made known and evident in the way in which he's made men and women. It's when these roles are fulfilled well, that things will work harmoniously both in the home and in the church itself. This will be the way in which the church itself will grow, where godly homes can be can grow, and that the spiritual health of an entire family can be maintained. And so these are the different responses. These are the different positions with regard to feminism. Ultimately, the Bible teaches patriarchy, which is good both for men and for women.